oh, you dressed up today. And you could see that was sort of pissing off Zelensky.
Look at this. We've been telling you he's not a decent president.
Fights between Biden and Zelensky behind closed doors.
They ended up like punching each other in the face.
That's not a good idea. That's essentially what seems to be happening in foreign policy. God knows what we're going to see next. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Culture Clash podcast, where Russian and American discuss and debate some of the hot topics in the news from the previous weeks. I'm Michael.
I'm Vlad. Hello, everyone.
Vladislav.
I'm still surprised when you called me by my full name. All right. Good. You're learning.
Exactly. So, Vlad, obviously, big topic in the news recently has been what's happening in Ukraine and what's happening between the U.S. and Ukraine, particularly after the meeting in the Oval Office. So that was sort of the meeting heard around the world where Trump and Zelensky and J.D. Vance very openly had a massive policy argument in front of the cameras, in front of the entire world. And obviously significant ramifications have ensued since then. So from your perspective, what is your assessment on what happened, what took place, what it means moving forward? You're Russian. Give us your Russian perspective.
Yeah, that's obviously, I think that was one of the loudest pieces of news that we have seen for weeks. That was like a cold shower for everybody, I guess. When I looked in the Russian media, though, I was surprised that it was not that widely covered. So it was more in the international. So here's my take on that. I already made the short reaction for our TikTok channel.
In a Boston Red Sox hat, I'm a Yankee fan. I was offended by that.
Really? Are
I
you?
am. Yeah.
Okay. I'm not a Boston Red Sox fan. I just happen to have the cap. But anyway, I like this cap, though. I have a couple of things to say about this. So first, I think, in a way, it was some sort of public setback for Zelensky. What I mean is, he came for a one-on-one meeting with the president, as president to president. He ended up in a press conference, in press covered debate, where he was one against three people, actually, which is the president, the vice president, and Rubio. I think he's Secretary of State. So basically, one against three major public figures. It's a different setup, right? It's a different setting. It's a different thing. He was obviously not ready for this setup. Another thing, and I think we'll cover it more in a moment, but I think this is why it went so differently. So he was not ready for this, like the press conference or formal negotiations. He still came with the casual military outfits, showing that I'm the wartime president. While I think even Trump mentioned this somewhere behind the scenes.
The first thing when he arrived, he was like, "Oh, you dressed up today."
Okay, yeah. So they expected him to be like a formal outfit, and this is important. This is a diplomatic protocol. We'll cover it in a moment, I guess. Another thing is, of course, it was super emotional. Again, this is something that Zelensky should have managed not to be that emotional, not to react, and because the guys obviously were trying to get these emotions out of him. They were provoking him, especially Vance was provoking him. So this was a couple of things that he could do differently. And overall, I think if you look at the international media, we can see that this clash between the US and Ukraine, it's a gift for Russian government, for Russian propaganda, for Russian operation, and so on. And I can obviously agree with that, because I think this is what they were counting on for quite some time. However, I was surprised that this was not that widely covered in Russian media. I would expect Russian propaganda to be full on board, in a full steam, covering look at this. We've been telling you he's not a decent president. We've been telling you for years now, and this is what you see. However, I haven't seen anything.
Within Russia,
yeah, internally.
Because Medvedev
Russian
tweeted,
media.
Peskov tweeted, there was a number of tweets that were really strong, but obviously geared towards an international audience.
Yes, and the tweets are not the same as if you look at the channels and all of that. So that was not widely covered, and I was surprised by that. Yeah, but overall, I think, again, if you look at the how to say, the history and in the essence of Ukrainian public politics, it didn't look that different. What I'm trying to say is, even from my childhood, when I was a little kid and I was watching Russian news, there were quite some episodes with Ukrainian parliament sessions, and I could easily remember a number of episodes where different fractions, different parties, they were arguing, and they were arguing so bad, they were arguing so hard that they ended up like punching each other in the face right in the parliament building, right in Rada, and it was a normal thing. Like, it was a very common thing. They had disagreement, they go full board, like they go very emotional. So Zelensky's behavior, it's not that different from the Ukrainian legacy policy. That's how I would say. However, of course, if you compare it with the standard, with the diplomatic protocol, with the standard like Western politics making, not policy making, politics making, politics shows and all of that, press conferences, of course, it was out of everything. It was completely different. Yeah, but I think so I think what we will cover is we will cover the meeting itself, what could go differently from the negotiations perspective. But what I also think is very important to discuss is what could be the implications. Because, again, if you look at the international media, everybody's kind of expecting some of the implications, some of more favors from the US towards Russia and so on. And especially when Trump says, like, it's easier for me to deal with Russia now than with Ukraine. However, I don't think it's so black and white, because right after the meeting, Trump said, okay, we extend the sanctions for 1 or 2 more years. And again, just recently, he threatened with more sanctions. I don't know what else can they sanction, but he threatened with more sanctions towards Russia if Russia does not agree to sit on the negotiations table. So I wouldn't say it's so black and white, and I would not agree with the overall media narrative when they say, like Trump is like dealing favors to Russia and so on.
I watched the whole thing. So I was out actually the night it was happening, and then I saw the news report. So I was keen to watch the full thing, get the full unfiltered, situation as to what happened. I think from my perspective, Zelensky came in already seemingly, in terms of his body language, in terms of his attitude, like he was agitated. So the entire time you saw him sitting there, cross-armed, you saw him, not really speaking the same way that Macron or Starmer, from France and the UK were speaking with Trump. Zelensky was sort of positioning himself as an equal to President Trump and to the U.S. administration, which I think was mistake number one. I think at the end of the day, the U.S. looks at this conflict, and supposedly, by the way, there were even fights between Biden and Zelensky behind closed doors, so over the phone and things like that. It wasn't widely reported. Obviously, it was never in public. But Biden also had some issues dealing with Zelensky. So I think in general, there was a tension in the air that was sort of palpable. And then obviously J.D. Vance sort of needles him a little bit,
Exactly.
and then, makes a few comments here. But again, was that right, wrong? Obviously, probably that wasn't in best taste, but it was Zelensky who chose to react to it. And that was my takeaway, was, okay, Vance sort of came in out of left field, sort of, made some comments to Zelensky that you would imagine he'd be offended by. So about, look, we need to deal at the negotiating table. And then Trump was asked, who do you prefer? And he said, look, I'm for America. I'm not taking sides. And you could see that was sort of pissing off Zelensky. And then Zelensky had to then take the opportunity to then call out JD to his face and not say Mr. Vice President or any of this stuff. So again, breaking decorum a little bit. Whereas JD is saying to Zelensky, Mr. President, Mr. President. Zelensky says, JD, what kind of diplomacy are you talking about? Russia for us are killers, terrorists, whatever. So immediately then, Zelensky gives the opportunity for Trump and Vance to pounce on him, because now they're having open discussion, open debate in front of the entire media. Trump hates that. Not only does he hate being disrespected, publicly disrespected, that's a terrible idea, absolutely terrible idea. And that was summarized by the Ukrainian ambassador, who literally had her head in her hands. I'm sure you saw the picture. Mm-hmm. It was a disaster. I think it was a complete disaster. And I do blame Zelensky. Again, I don't blame Zelensky for being upset. Obviously, what Trump and Vance were saying would be offensive, obviously. But I blame him for not having the diplomatic know-how and diplomatic awareness to control his feelings, let it out behind closed doors. You want to give Trump and Vance a lecture? go ahead. But publicly, terrible idea. And what we saw was immediately what happened. Trump kicked Zelensky and the team out of the White House. I've never seen or heard of that before. Kicked them out of the White House. Then Zelensky goes and does an interview with Fox News that evening. Fox News is asking, okay, you know, Zelensky, do you want to apologize to Trump? He doesn't apologize to Trump. So clearly Zelensky is still trying to maintain this sort of, you know, macho view where he doesn't want to back down to Trump. And the one thing I would say is that's not a good idea. Not only is it a bad idea, but you want something from Trump. What is the way to get something from Trump? It's definitely not to try to fight with him or try to have an ego battle. You're going to lose that every time if you want something from Trump. So then Zelensky gets kicked out, goes right to London, meets with all the European leaders. Europe is all up in arms because obviously America then right after that said, okay, fine, you don't want to make a deal, no minerals deal. We're going to cut off military aid, which they've now done. So future military aid is now suspended. They've also suspended intelligence collaboration. So literally in a matter of a few days, American policy on Ukraine took a 180, a complete 180-degree turn. So I think overall it was a disastrous press conference, disastrous, particularly for Ukraine. Implications behind this, I think, are many, and we're now seeing it happen in real time. So obviously today, the Russians are pushing back in Kursk region, where they've been fighting the Ukrainians after the Ukrainians invaded Kursk. They're obviously seeing some breakthroughs right now. Could that be related to the intelligence sharing? We don't really know. But regardless, over time, with America no longer supporting Ukraine militarily, no longer providing that intelligence, that's not something that could be replaced. The Europeans can't replace that. They can replace some of the weaponry, but they're not going to be able to replace, for example, the anti-aircraft and a lot of the stuff that America has been providing to Ukraine. That's one issue. So now Ukraine's further on the back foot in the conflict with Russia. So now I think the most important question is, what do the Europeans do? Because Zelensky immediately went to London to meet with Starmer, Macron, and all the European leaders, and they all talked a good game. Okay, America is no longer reliable. Fair. I think that's true in many senses. I mean, you know, is America still going to be supporting Europe the way it has previously? Question mark. We don't know. Are they going to support Ukraine the way they did previously? Clearly not. So I think the million-dollar question is going to be, what do the Europeans do moving forward vis-a-vis Ukraine? We're hearing talks about deploying troops, which we talked about at our year-end podcast a few months ago. That would be mainly British and French. We're seeing the Germans talk about a, what did I read, 300 billion euro package, something like that, which they would need to suspend the budget. Like there's a limit on how much the German government can spend. They would have to suspend that in order to spend all this additional money on Ukraine. This would be, by the way, a 10% increase in the overall German budget, which is pretty wild, right? We're talking about the Europeans looking to raise, I think, almost €1 trillion in extra money and funding for Ukraine. These European governments don't really have this money. So if the Americans are complaining we don't have money, the Europeans are even in less of an advantageous position. They don't even have a defense industrial base like the Americans do to the same extent. And they've got a lot of political turmoil internally as well. So we just saw with the elections in Germany, the far right was the biggest winner and the far left was the biggest winner. So what's that going to mean if you see the UK, France, Germany, countries with, again, bad budgetary situations, spending all this additional money on defense to support Ukraine, when they've got big movements in their countries, right-wing movements in particular, that are against supporting Ukraine? This is a dangerous cocktail, I think, for Europe, particularly if Europe wants to then deploy troops into Ukraine. That's going to put them, you know, face-to-face possibly with Russian troops. So I think the fallout from this is enormous. I think we don't even know how to quantify it yet. But I think what's very clear is that America's taking a totally different approach to Russia-Ukraine. I think you made a great point, though. We don't know if America's going to be, you know, the media is saying, oh, America's now pro-Russia. Not necessarily, right? As you said.
Not necessarily at all.
We've extended sanctions. I see in some areas Trump is talking about maybe lifting certain sanctions on oligarchs, on certain industries, maybe the oil price cap. But then at the same time, he comes out and says, we might throw a bunch more sanctions on if Russia doesn't come to the table. Fine. Mixed messages. This is classic Trump. And then Trump's also said, you know, the Russians are easier to deal with than Ukraine. Fine. I think once again, he's trying to sort of bully both sides or do whatever he needs to do to both sides to bring them together. The issue that I think Trump is facing and will face, and again, I think he's making a much fairer attempt than Biden did to end this conflict. Trump clearly wants to end the conflict. But I really don't see how it ends. I really don't see how it ends in the near term, because you've got two sides that want totally different things. So Ukraine wants the opportunity to continue to fight the Russians to try to kick them off the territory Russia's taken. And they want security guarantees. America's not giving security guarantees to Ukraine. There's a 0% chance of that. Do you think, and this is the question I think people in Europe don't really appreciate, do you think the Americans want to risk fighting a war with Russia in mainland Europe, in Ukraine, for what purpose? It's really not in our core interest, which goes to a whole nother thing around realism and geopolitics,
Right.
what is changing, obviously, with Trump. But I think America is simply not interested in spending the money or getting involved. So now the ball is in Europe's court. Europe, what are you going to do? Because without major support, Ukraine's going to be in severe trouble. And Russia's going to have the clear upper hand in the conflict, unless Europe gets much deeper involved. And then what's that going to mean for the future of relations on the continent? But I think regardless, the conflict took a dramatic turn, I think, with that press conference being the seminal event. And now I think Russia clearly has the upper hand diplomatically as well as militarily. And it's anybody's guess what happens next. But ball's in Ukraine's court, sorry, not Ukraine's court, Europe's court. What are they going to do to fill the American gap? And time will tell.
But I think, like we as humans, we tend to judge by the event rather than by the process. I don't think that just one press conference or one meeting could create a lot of troubles. That was the eruption. That was the blast. But I think it all started a little bit before. As you said, it was all about the tensions, rising tensions between Ukraine and the U.S. about like how they are going to support it further. What does Ukraine need from the support perspective? There were a lot of debates about the minerals, about deploying troops to protect the potential operations on these mines, or I don't know actually what they're gonna build there, if they're gonna build anything. But again, that was kind of an idea of the somewhat of security guarantees, because actually I think Trump openly said that if we have this deal, we will deploy the troops to protect the assets.
Not troops. So Trump's point was, if we have American workers on the ground, that is in and of itself us getting involved in the conflict. Therefore, it's a pseudo guarantee.
Oh, okay. So you're going to have like the American citizens working there. So
Russia's not going to dare to kill them, is what Trump is saying. But Zelensky's also right. It's not a security guarantee.
Yeah, it's not
just
a security
American
guarantee.
workers.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, okay. Yeah. Anyway, so these are the rising tensions. And I don't think that the one press conference caused these potential implications that we're talking about. But what I think also interesting is, and I've been thinking about this a lot recently, again, the rising tensions about how Trump and how the U.S. administration will treat the situation in Europe overall in the upcoming future. And I think the more distant America becomes, it can go, again, either direction. It either can unite Europe further because, okay, now you guys are on your own and you need to do something to, okay, if you want to protect Ukraine, if you want to deal with the conflict, then I don't know, is it the right way to say, but you need to step up and you need to think about how you're going to do this on your own without relying on American support. Or moving even further, I think for the recent, 70 to 80 years after the foundation of the European Union, the United States has been playing this role of the security guarantee through NATO, through Marshall Act and Marshall Plan. America has been playing the role of the security of the protector of the Europe. Now the more distant it becomes, and again we know about all these debates or hints that America will decrease their presence in NATO, or NATO will be reformed, and so on and so on. So the more distant America becomes, again, Europe will need to deal with it on their own. So that I think might also, trigger the security development in Europe. They will need to reshape the rebuild the security architecture in the European Union. And I think this will be the major implication that we will see.
Major implication. I totally agree. But then here's the basic question, and this is where, this is where I think the media, particularly Western media, particularly the proponents of the old world order, and now I'm calling it the old world order because essentially it looks like it's collapsing right before our eyes, where America, as you said, was security guarantor globally, but then particularly in Europe. And we still have 80,000 troops, by the way, in Europe. But I think the basic thing is, then a lot of these commentators will say, oh, well, if the Americans pull out of Europe, the Europeans are going to, unite, rally against the Americans, and suddenly America's going to have no friends. I don't believe that. I really fundamentally don't believe that. And I think, as you said, Europe has two options. They unite to try to, defend their security interests as they see them, or they splinter and go their separate ways. But what have we talked about since the beginning of this podcast? That you've had this ascendant far right in Europe, which is nationalist, which is in many ways isolationist, which is anti-EU, which is anti-European unity. So you're also then dealing with a continent that has a really bad fiscal situation, right? I mean, countries like Germany, countries like the UK, they don't have a lot of money, spare money, to suddenly be throwing hundreds of billions of euros to want to defend Ukraine. So I agree with you. These are the two options. However, I think what's most likely to happen, if you wanted to, if you're looking for my prediction, I think the Europeans will unite in the short term, as they already have. And they're going to pull together, maybe €1 trillion. It could happen. They're going to start pumping in a lot more money to Ukraine. They're going to try to keep Ukraine afloat for a longer period of time. But what's that going to look like if and when the economy starts to slow down? There's so much uncertainty in this economy right now. On top of that, we haven't had a recession since COVID, which was sort of a manufactured recession. So typically business cycles anywhere from 5 to 8 years. We're 5 years outside of COVID. We've got high interest rates. The risk of economic downturn is quite high. And in that environment, you're going to be ramping up defense spending massively to fight this war in Ukraine, which a lot of people in Europe don't view as an existential threat. So again, the far right in Germany, they'd like to make a deal with Russia. They don't even want to support Ukraine at all. There are folks in the UK, Nigel Farage and the Reform Party, that are a bit more middle ground on Ukraine. Marine Le Pen of the far right movement in France, skeptical of supporting Ukraine. So how quickly and how long can the Europeans keep Ukraine afloat with all this money that they don't have in this fractured political environment? I would venture to guess this will end up, if the Europeans go all in to support Ukraine, I think this will end up devastating Europe politically. And I think the far right's rise is only going to be accelerated because, again, just like what happened in America with Trump, Americans and the MAGA movement was saying, why are we spending all of our American resources on Ukraine? Why are we involved in this conflict? It's so far away. Do we need to be involved? So Trump essentially pulls us out. How quick before the Europeans do that? How quick before the Germans do that? Or the French or the British? I think it's an open question. I think the countries, obviously, that are going to maintain, this posture, Poland is obviously on the border with Belarus, which is essentially part of Russia, right? You've got the Baltic states, obviously, that are, facing, they're like an hour away from St. Petersburg, I think, in Estonia. So you've got a few of these fault lines in Europe. But then again, you've got Hungary, who wants no part of this and has already said they don't want to support any funding for Ukraine. You've got Slovakia, who's already said we're not really that interested. So again, how quickly before this coalition falls apart? I think this is the risk Europe runs. However, as you said, this is the two-pronged options. Europe unites and becomes really a force globally, which it could in theory. But the more likely, in my opinion, outcome is going to be, sure, they try to unite, they fail to unite, and it ends up dividing Europe even further. And that's the conclusion that I have. That again, and we talked about it on our EU episode and multiple different episodes, if we're saying, and we both kind of did, that the EU is doomed to fail, is getting involved in a military conflict going to help to keep Europe united? I just don't see it. I really don't see it.
I didn't say, though, that EU is doomed to fail. It was your take.
Well,
I said EU. I said EU will reform. And
if it doesn't reform, you said they're done.
Yes. I said that EU. It's essential for EU to reform, and I still think that they're on the way to do this.
So you think they will reform?
Yeah, and I still think that even those two directions that we just described, I think this is also one of the way how they can reform. But again, the question is what they're going to do, and we don't know. Because again, if they find a way to deal with the security architecture, this will be one of the steps towards the reformation of the whole European Union. But again, you have the far right rise, which is the threat. But again, I think in none of these countries yet we don't see the dominant far rights
Yet.
Yeah,
So again,
we see the rise, but and I think it was threatening in Germany in the recent elections in Germany that far right might take too much and might take might be too successful. Hasn't happened yet.
They saw the biggest gains, them and the far left, to be fair, both skeptical of support for Ukraine. So I agree with you, it hasn't happened yet. But if you look at a country like Germany, where Volkswagen has, as we covered before, first layoffs in 80 years, where you've got the economic situation pretty much abysmal, the outlook is terrible. The main source of cheap gas, which was fueling the German factories, was from Russia. Now they want to consider, more directly confronting Russia. Okay, I guess good luck with that economically. You've got the Chinese electric cars that are undercutting the famous German car industry. And then you've got Europe, who's been, not Europe, the UK, who's laid off police officers and closed police departments because they don't have the money internally to fund this stuff. And yet they're going to find this money to support Ukraine. All I'm saying is, regardless of what the moral value of this question is, regardless of what is right or wrong or what anybody should do, I just don't see it. I don't see it sustaining. I see these countries in deep economic turmoil, in deep fiscal stress. And I think that's going to come to the fore. And if you want to go deeper and deeper into this rabbit hole of the conflict, and now without the Americans, you want to be the ones financially keeping Ukraine afloat, because, by the way, it's much more complicated than just military aid. Ukraine has to keep their pension system afloat. They have to keep their government finances and budgets working. They've relied on a lot of foreign support for that as well.
Right.
And if Russia's going to start to attack the energy facilities and some of the grain facilities and the port, infrastructure in Odessa, and you no longer have American anti-missile, Patriot missile systems and things like that, the war will get more and more costly for Ukraine. So again, if Europe's going to take that burden on, I think the risk is that Europe might be biting off more than it can chew. But we're going to find out. And I think it's going to be interesting. But again, my assessment is, if Europe wants to unite over this conflict, it will unite in the short term, but it will only accelerate and lead to the long-term collapse of the EU. I said 10 years last time. Who knows? Maybe that could be even quicker if they're going to throw all this money and ramp up all this defense production when they don't really have the money to begin with.
I think overall what we observe here is, is the different concept of international relations on the geopolitics. I can see that it's changing. Since the World War II, there was a dominant, until the World War II, there was a dominant theory of international relations, which is the political realism, where that clearly states that all the countries, all the states, they act in their own national interest. Everything is about their own national interest, and basically this is how you get the equality. So country A has their own interest, they pursue this. Then you have country B. If it's not powerful enough to compete with country A, they unite with country C, and this is how you maintain the balance of power. And basically everybody is realizing their national interest. This is like same way as in the in the competitive economy, like everybody's acting in their own interest, and this is how you keep the balance. So eventually, like you all balance each other. So this was all the this notion of the political realism until I think actually not until World War II, until the Cold War, and then after the World War II, when the United Nations as an organization was was created, and there were a lot of talks and a lot of strong movement towards the world government, the international government, and something like that. When we see all these integration processes, EU is the greatest example of that. Then the concept of the international relations shifted towards what is called the idealism in the international relations. What they say is that national interest is not the dominant anymore, but the wider overall wider good, public good is what is dominant, and not the nations that they should not pursue their interest, but they should think how it affects the others, especially those who are not as powerful. And if you have any disputes, if you have any conflicts, then
You talk about it.
you talk about it, but not only you just talk about it, but the international government talks about it, and the international cooperation is the tool how to deal with that. And I think with the development of the European Union, with the development of a lot of good and positive actually United Nations initiatives, this notion, this movement of the political idealism, it was quite dominant. But now again, we have seen it a little bit earlier. We saw it with the they called it neorealism, where you don't realize your national interest with power, you realize it with soft power, with economic power, with culture, and so on. Okay, but now I think we can see even in the pure geopolitical concept where there is another shift of this pendulum again, where we might slowly moving from the idealism to realism again. And when strong actor like the United States start behaving and start being vocal about their own national interest and saying, it's not in our interest anymore to be involved in the conflict, even though we might started it, then it sounds very different. It sounds very edgy, and it sounds very, counter to it. I don't know if it can be the word, but it's
contradictory.
Contradictory to the common notion. That's why it sounds very different, and I think this is what we observe now. And I'm not saying that we will all become, all the countries will become realistic and realist in this way, but I think we have I mean, as a world community, we have forgot about this, that everybody is acting actually in their own national interest. And now it sounds completely, it sounds weird. And again, in your example, it is kind of against national interest for European countries, right? To be more involved. However, according to idealism and idealist theory, it is completely in line with this idealist theory, because you are for moral good, you need to support those who need your support, and this is how you preserve the peace and the stability. Again, so if you operate in this paradigm, they are acting completely right. If you think about it from a realistic perspective, they are acting completely wrong. However, again, in my opinion, I think the idealism theory and idealism paradigm, it is very good in preserving peace, and it is very good in all the humanitarian initiatives, yes. But when it comes to the hard things, to the hard power, it has no power. It has no real value. This theory, it does not provide the explanation how the countries, and when we talk about international relations theories, we're talking about countries. So this theory of idealism, it does not provide the answer how the countries should behave, because it's too idealistic, as it comes from the name, to assume that countries will just give up their powers to some international cooperation and everything will be resolved there. And especially when you have the strongest actors, the permanent actors of the Security Council of the United Nations, they are in the conflict, they are in disagreement. How are you gonna cooperate with that without being realist, without being rational in the behavior?
Well, here's my question. Do you actually believe that the world was ever governed by idealism?
In certain layers. In certain layers. What I mean by that is I firmly believe that the United Nations initiatives when it comes to, humanitarian missions, supporting anti-famine, and all these initiatives, they created a better world. But when it comes to the hard power and when it comes to the economic power, no, I don't.
Yeah, I agree. So I think it was, and that's why I brought this book, and I'll talk slightly more about it later.
Good.
But this guy, Peter Zeihan, this is, to me, the geopolitical Bible that has...
What is it called?
So this is his second book, called The Absent Superpower. And his first book was called The Accidental Superpower. This is his second book, The Absent Superpower. And he goes through, trying to build a framework for what is the order that existed post-World War II? Why did it exist? Why did America suddenly take a 180-degree turn from its historical foreign policy, which had been isolationist.
Being distant from Europe as much as they could.
And it always had until the end of World War II. And he points out that your former country, the Soviet Union, represented as the other superpower the biggest threat that America ever faced. It had a very potent ideology in communism, a global ideology, the largest standing military on the planet, nuclear weapons beginning in 1948, I think it was. So you guys represented such a massive threat that America had to craft a new order that would be beneficial to its allies as much or more so than it was to America itself. So what was that? That was the Marshall Plan, rebuild Europe. That was create this new alliance network. That was free up global markets to promote global trade, even if it was at the expense of American companies and American economic interest.
This is the realization of the idealism concept.
But it's not idealism. It's realism under the facade of idealism. At the end of the day, it was because, and this is his argument, Peter Zeihan, and I've read now 3 of his books. I think he's got a 4th one out. Sorry, 4 of his books. He might have a 5th one now. Highly recommend him. And he was saying, no, this was all done in America's security interest, realistic security interest. Why did it support Europe? Because Europe would have to be on the front line of a potential fight with the Soviets. Why did it support South Korea, Japan, all this, all of our other alliances around the world? Because they were going to have to be involved in any potential conflict with the Soviet Union or China. Why did the U.S. open up to China in 1971 when Nixon went to Beijing? Because America was fighting the big red menace in the Soviet Union. So now that foreign policy realistic objective had been achieved, America won the Cold War. We no longer face, the threat of the mighty Soviet army rolling through Europe and then threatening American interests closer to home. So now we're seeing America lose interest in this world. And what Peter Zeihan laid out, he wrote this book in 2015, particularly now that America is energy independent. We're the largest oil producer on the planet. I think we're the largest natural gas exporter as well, LNG, or one of them. So we're completely self-sufficient. So we no longer need global energy markets. We no longer need the old security apparatus to protect us from the Soviet Union. So the open question was, when is America going to lose interest? And it was only a matter of time. And it has been happening over time now for the past couple of years, and Trump is only accelerating that process. So when people say, oh, Trump's giving up American values, oh my God, what is he doing? He's literally making America a pariah. Pariah, no, I completely disagree with that. It's not like America's going to lose all of its friends overnight because, it's giving up support for Ukraine, but it's that America no longer finds these old institutions and old, ways of doing things as useful to itself. So what has Trump said 1,000 times? America first. That's been the core of his concept from the beginning. That's essentially what seems to be happening in foreign policy. The isolationists in America have taken back power for the first time in 80 years, and they're looking for America to be less involved globally. So I think what that's going to mean is, obviously, as you said, a more chaotic world, a more unstable world, a less prosperous world. It is a net negative for humanity. I agree with that. But you could make the argument that it's in America's foreign policy interest and in the economic interest of America, the country. So it is a shame. Look, you saw something very similar from the period of 1815 when Napoleon was defeated, thanks to you guys, the British and the coalition forces. And in 1815, there was a Vienna Conference. Okay. And essentially Britain rewrote the rules of trade. And you had a period of intense globalization from 1815 through 1914. And if you look at some of the data from the late 19aughts, they call it, late 1910s, the world was extremely globalized at that period of time. Not as much as now, but for its period of time in history, very globalized. And then Britain no longer had the power, finances, or whatever to uphold the system. Then you had Germany challenging the system, and eventually it led to conflict and the breakdown of the order, which took 30 years to rebuild when America came up and reestablished a new order. We may be going through that process now. It seems like we are, which obviously is bad for the world. That's probably going to mean more likelihood of conflict, less prosperity, more chaos, more dislocation, less globalization. We've talked about all these things. But I don't think anybody should be surprised by this. I think people, particularly the Europeans, when they act shocked and backstabbed, okay, how long did you think America was going to pay for your defense? Because America still has 80,000 troops in Europe. How long did you expect that to happen? In perpetuity? Is that just the forever American guarantee? In geopolitics, alliances shift all the time. France and Britain fought a 100 years war in the Middle Ages, and now they're best of friends. These things change. I'm not saying America's going to abandon Europe. I don't believe it will. I don't think that's in America's interest either. But for America to rewrite its relationship with the core countries that it considers to be its countries of interest, I think is happening, which makes me want to go into the tariff topic, which I think is also related. So we're seeing it on the military front, the diplomatic front. We're also seeing it on the trade front. So my question to you, what's your assessment on Trump's litany of tariffs that he's launching against China, the European Union, Mexico, Canada? Pretty much anybody that comes across his desk, he's looking at tariff. What's your assessment on that?
Okay, you didn't let me a chance to
go ahead.
Counter
React.
on that.
Yeah, react.
No, I mean, I love this take about the Vienna Congress and all this development and the globalized world. I just love this because, first, that the Vienna Congress and this pentarchy of the superpowers, it is considered by all the international relations scholars as the most stable world structure.
Pax Britannica.
Not Pax Britannica, but this pentarchy of the superpowers.
That's what it was called, that period of peace.
Yeah, I mean, Pax Britannica is because they covered the half of the world.
Yeah.
True. But this Congress, because it was the peacekeeping mechanism, and this pentarchy of the superpowers acting in their own interest but balancing each other, was the most is considered as the most stable architecture. And why I'm saying this is because I disagree with the point that you say that the world will become more chaotic, because I think irrespective of what's happening, everybody's still seeking for the balance of power. I mean, everybody, every state, the balance of power. And it means that, okay, the balance of power was preserved mainly by the United States. Okay, now, if they're taking a step back, for example, then we will see the different powerhouses balancing each other. So probably it will be, I don't know, completely different alliances. And I'm not saying that it will be necessarily, like 190 countries acting against each other. We will see different alliances and different integrations and different powerhouses of the power.
And you think that'll be more peaceful?
I'm not sure about the... Actually, yes. I think it will be peaceful. Why? You know why? Because I think that the open military conflict is very... Like, it's not in anybody's interest when you have it.
Okay, it doesn't mean it doesn't happen. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen.
But if we shift over the realism and the country behave in their own national interest, then I think it will be less.
So you think it's going to be less violent and more peaceful with America pulling out of the world?
You will have a lot of small conflicts. Yes, because the America.
I couldn't disagree more. I could not disagree more. Think about what's going to happen with this Ukraine fight. If the British and French want to deploy troops to Ukraine, that already turns a local conflict, which would be considered, even though it's the largest European conflict since World War II, a local conflict that could become a multinational conflict. How long before Russia then mass mobilizes?
And you still have the security architecture that will prevent them from doing this.
Like what?
I mean, you still have NATO that will prevent them from doing this.
If America's pulling out of that, if America no longer wants to give security guarantees.
How much time will it take for America to pull out of NATO?
It could happen next week at this rate. I mean, I think these are open questions, but that's my point. This is what it means when America pulls out. So if America, and Trump was asked, would you defend Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, all these countries? He's like, well, if they don't pay their money, no, I don't want to defend them. He said that outright. He said Poland might be a different story. And Poland historically has always been the linchpin. Once you march on Poland, that's typically when Western powers, get agitated or get involved. That was World War II. Maybe that's going to be the case now. But if Trump is even floating the idea that he wouldn't give an Article 5 guarantee to the Baltic states, then Russia could roll into the Baltics. So that, again, raises the risk of widening the conflict. So if America's pulling out, this is all theoretical, and is weakening its relationship with Taiwan, for example, how quickly before the Chinese want to mobilize and try to do something about that?
Taiwan is a different thing.
Well, this is what I'm saying, but the American security architecture is what underwrites this peace. Why was World War averted from 1815 and 1914? The British were simply too strong. Nobody could challenge them. The Germans tried to challenge them. The Germans were rising. The security architecture was failing. Britain no longer could, keep the world on its shoulders, and that ended in war, because at the end of the day, hegemony has proven to be the greatest guarantor of peace globally. You had the Pax Romana back in ancient times when Rome became so powerful and so large, nobody could challenge it. That conflict essentially disappeared for a period of time. Local conflicts along the borders, fine. But throughout the entirety of Roman territory, there was no conflict for the most part. So these are these situations. This is what I'm saying. If America pulls out, I think the risk of global conflict, of regional conflict spikes. If America brings its 80,000 troops home from Europe, okay, then what? What's to stop a wider war between Russia, Ukraine, possibly other members of Europe? It could happen. And there's plenty of tensions and reasons why it might metastasize. Why wouldn't, if America pulls out of South Korea, what are the chances that Kim Jong-un in North Korea wants to unite the Korean Peninsula under his flag? It's possible. So I think we underestimate the role America's played. America's still got 30,000 troops in South Korea. So look at America's global footprint. And if it reduces that footprint, I don't see how you can make the argument the world's going to be a safer place. I think it's going to be a more destabilized and more dangerous place. You would eventually have regional hegemons rise, but that's probably after the wars that would happen, where you would determine, okay, who's actually the stronger power in that given region. So I think the risks globally spike as America pulls out, which is why I'm saying, again, I think the world gets put in a more precarious position, even if at the same time it's perhaps in America's economic interest and no longer in its core foreign policy interest to be involved as it is globally. Again, it's a shock to the system because America for 100 years has been this guarantor of peace. And if it no longer wants to do that, I mean, God knows what we're going to see next, but it could be dramatic, I think is my argument.
We will see a lot of more different alliances, I guess. Because if you lose your security guarantee, you will need to build a new one. So we will see.
But you need someone strong enough to build it under their banner. Otherwise, why am I going to listen to whoever? Just like the Axis powers in World War II, they had an alliance network, but they were operating independently of each other. So Germany was doing what it wanted to do in Europe. Japan was doing what it wanted to do in Asia. Italy was doing what it could do, in places like Africa and other areas. So, I don't think that's a recipe for peace. I think that's a recipe for when there's no strong individual power, then you're likely to have these fights.
So you think that, like, when you have one dominant power, it is more stable than you have 1, 2, 3, several power players?
I think unipolarity or bipolarity probably are the best systems in terms of guaranteeing peace. You can have peace in a multipolar order, but the problem is once any one of those powers begins to shrink, in terms of power relative to others, then their interest can be threatened by the more powerful members of that multipolar world. So if we're saying that, okay, the Americans are going to control and have, full autonomy over North and South America, the Chinese are going to be operating in Asia, the Russians want to take on Europe, well then maybe they're going to come into clash with the European Union, and then we're going to see who's stronger. But that in and of itself is a recipe for conflict. And then how quickly before the Chinese threaten Japanese interests, and then how quickly do the Americans say, well, we do have some interest in the Pacific, maybe we're going to get involved in this conflict to support Japan. The risks, I think, go up massively when you've got this, when you have this multipolar world. I think one power has proven historically, whether it was Rome, Britain, or America, or even the American-Soviet system, was also relatively stable.
Yeah.
So
with that, I would agree.
I think unipolarity or bipolarity, when you've got, but bipolarity requires the two powers to be pretty similar in strength.
Bipolarity is the balance of power.
And it was.
I mean, I only disagree with you when you say that when you contrast the unipolarity as like one dominant country and, I don't know, like a bunch of small actors versus multipolarity where you say there is no big actors and only the small ones, because I think in that case, you get chaos because every country in the world has their own like territorial flaming conflicts, and this is the recipe for the open wide military conflict. But multipolarity is when you have several powerhouses balancing.
Tell me one time in history where there was a multipolar global order that lasted or was somehow stable.
Your example, the one you were talking about, Pax Britannica, which was not a Pax Britannica. You had multiple countries. And then what caused the war was not the one country going against another. It was one bloc going against the other.
But the two blocks were dominated by individual countries, right? So at the end of the day, I would disagree with that assessment in the sense that, from my perspective, the British had emerged from that conflict, even though the Russians were extremely instrumental in that conflict as well. Still, I think the British came out far and away the superior and strongest power and the power broker in Europe. So again, the Russians weren't able to hold on to all the territory that they could have claimed as part of the Napoleonic Wars, because the British would have come in and said, this is how we're going to divvy up Europe. These are going to be, you get this, you get this, you get this, and this is how we're going to do things. And
it was not British guys who divided the Europe after the Napoleonic Wars. It was the Congress, like the hardest negotiation process in history.
Who was the most influential and strongest power?
5 countries.
Who was the strongest?
You had 5 countries. It was not like the strongest.
So who?
Basically, so you had the Great Britain. I think it was just Britain at that time. You had French, even though they lost the war, they were still one of the 5 architects of
They lost territory.
They kept their own. They kept their own, everything they got before they started the expansion. So then you had the Austro-Hungarian, Austrian Empire at that time. You had Russian Empire at that time, and you had the
so why is it
Prussia,
called?
right?
Why is it called? Yeah, Prussia.
Yeah.
So why is it called the Pax Britannica?
Because British called it Pax Britannica for them, because they controlled this world through the colonies.
Yeah, because they were the most powerful country in that arrangement.
It was their world. It was not the.
It was their world. Yeah.
It was not the time. They didn't call it as the time. Pax Britannica.
So who was the most powerful country during that 100-year period?
Yeah, with that I would agree.
Okay, and could anybody challenge the British? No, because
they're constantly challenged by French everywhere.
The French had been defeated in the Napoleonic Wars. So the British had the only navy
and it took them less than 10 years to start challenging Britain in all the colonies.
And they challenged them unsuccessfully. And then eventually France became an ally of Britain 100 years later, when they then fought a war with Germany, who was the real challenger, who was, prior to World War I, building up this massive naval apparatus. And they were the ones who wanted to take on the British. Anyways, we could go deeper into this topic, and
let's write it down. It's a great one.
It is a good one. It is a good one. I think you're wrong, which is fine. I usually think that, which is no surprise, but it is an interesting topic. But this is my only point. I think, so fine, you may assess that that period of time could be stable if there's somehow a similar order. I'm instead likening it to the 1920s and 30s, where once World War I was over, Britain was substantially weakened from that conflict. It came out the victor, but weakened. Germany came out as the challenging power to Britain, weakened, but still ascendant. And then particularly, obviously, they rebuilt the military and all of that. But America was the real power that was on the rise. So when no individual power had the capability, finances, or apparatus to control the peace, that's why then World War II was inevitable.
Everything was freaking ruined. Of course, there was like 20 years of peace, and everybody wanted their revenge. The Second World War was inevitable.
Because nobody was powerful enough to prevent. But that's the whole thing with Treaty of Versailles. So they punished the Germans, but they didn't have the power to enforce the punishment. So the Germans naturally very quickly started to remilitarize when the Nazis came to power, and they started to expand, and nobody either had the capability, the will, or whatever it was to fight the Germans. And it wasn't until 6 years later, when they invaded Poland, that finally the Allies said, okay, we're going to get involved. And how long did the Allies last? France fell within a matter of months. Britain was left on its own, and it took the massive contribution from the Soviet Union and eventually American involvement, which eventually, brought down Nazi Germany. So my only point here is, because nobody had the power, the Soviet Union was not the powerhouse that it eventually was pre-World War II, nor were the Americans. But the war helped to mobilize both countries, and as they came out as the victors, then it was their world to divvy up. And that's essentially what happened. So what I'm saying is, we're entering a world where America's pulling back, America's no longer interested, it has the military might, but the financial situation isn't great. America wants to cut spending, America wants to save money, America wants to deal with this massive debt, which is a huge issue and risk to our prosperity. So then who's going to fill in that void? I mean, this is the situation. That's why I liken it to that unstable period after World War I, when who's really running the world? As you said, we're going from idealism to realism, and who really wants to run the world? Nobody seems to be stepping forward. America seems to be wanting to pull back. which is what's happening. Trump has literally said, oh, yeah, maybe I'll defend them. Maybe I'll defend them. Maybe I won't defend them. I don't care about them. You know, J.D. Vance says, oh, some random country. We don't seem to be interested anymore. And nobody else seems to have the capacity. I think this is where China's role is going to be very interesting. And China's come out multiple times since Trump's come to power. And China made one point, one about the tariffs, and said something like, if America wants a trade war or any other type of war, we're ready to fight till the end. Okay, China's talking tough, fine. But then China also said something that they're opposed to this bullying hegemony that the Americans are sort of representing now. So the Chinese seem to be interested in wanting to take this larger global role. Do they have the capacity? That's a different question. Do people trust them? Another question. So again, it seems a bit to me like this World War I situation of you've got America that seems to want to pull out from the world. By some metrics declining, you can make the argument. You've got this ascendant power in China that seems to want a bigger piece of the pie, AKA Germany, pre-World War I. It strikes me as, and there's a book that was written about it, that talks about the Thucydides trap. You know Thucydides trap? Thucydides was one of the Greek historians who talked about why war between Athens and Sparta was inevitable. Because Athens was the, I think, was the ascending power, Sparta was the declining power, and eventually they were going to fight. So again, when you've got this dynamic, and eventually they did, and it was a brutal war, and I think Sparta eventually lost, but Athens also, you know, it was bad for Athens too. So when you've got this rising and declining power dynamic, risk of conflict spikes. And now you've got the same dynamic in regions as well. So Russia's a declining power in Europe. You know, the European Union in some ways is either a, you know, looks like a declining power, but you could argue if it unites might be an ascending power. So there's another power dynamic there. So you've got local power dynamics, then you've got America versus China. I think the world just looks extremely unstable and at high risk. But yeah, that's my assessment. That's my assessment.
I think we're just shifting from unipolar to...
You think it's going to be peaceful and... Oh, you're always the optimist, right? I'm the pessimist.
Yeah.
I'm saying the economy is screwed. By the way, I'm sticking by my stock market crash 2025. I'm sticking by that. I said 25 to 50%. So far, we're at 6%. I'm sticking to that one. I'm pessimistic on geopolitics as well. I think it's going to be a complicated couple of years ahead. Thanks, everybody, for tuning into another episode of the Culture Clash podcast. If you like our content, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Like our videos if you appreciate the content. Follow us on TikTok. Follow us on Instagram. And look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks.